Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about everybody's favorite country, Poland. Now, do I mean that in the sense that everybody, historically speaking, just really loved Poland and wanted to be best friends with them? No, the exact opposite, in fact. Instead, I mean it in the sense that it seems like basically since the formation of what we could call Poland back in the 10th century or so, its neighboring countries really wanted a piece of it, and it seems like Poland had it much worse than others. Back in those days, conquering and just neighboring kingdoms fighting one another was far more common than it is now, but Poland seemed to be a prime target. Now, I'm not really up to date on my Polish history, so I don't know exactly why Poland was such a prime target for nearly 1,000 years, and if you are more aware of this, please do put it down in the comments. But as Europe reached the 20th century, Poland didn't even exist at this point, and it wouldn't be until the end of the First World War that a brand new Polish state would be formed in the ruins of an incredibly brutal and devastating war. As we all know, this new Polish state would quickly turn into a target yet again, a target of Germany to the west and Russia to the east, and the eventual invasion of Poland in 1939 officially ignited the Second World War. In this invasion being attacked on several fronts, Poland would fall rather quickly in just over a month, and it would be divided broadly into the German and Soviet spheres of influence, and more precisely, Polish territory would be divided to Germany, the Soviets, Lithuania, and Slovakia, although Lithuania was with the Soviets and Slovakia was with Germany. So, keeping in mind that Poland as it stood at the outbreak of World War II was a very new country, and also keeping in mind that they were defeated in about a month or so, I want to talk about two things. What exactly made Poland so easy to conquer? And what was their primary aircraft in the defense of their country? Specifically, their primary fighter. With those previous two things kept in mind, one would likely make the assumption that Poland had a very weak military with poor equipment that was far outdated and inferior to the Germans and the Soviets. In that assumption, you'd be half right. To understand why Poland fell as quickly as they did, we first have to talk about everything that was going on in the country before the invasion happened. When the Polish state was reformed back in 1918, even before they could really do anything at all, the new Polish government would have a very tough task ahead of them, as they would be reformed from territory that had been held by the likes of the Russian Empire and the German Empire for over 100 years. In that span, broader technological differences and ethnic differences would make these two halves of Poland quite different. For a pretty good comparison, imagine the North and South in the US Civil War. The North was more technologically advanced and urban, and had far greater manufacturing capabilities, while the South was more about agriculture, and they were more rural with lesser manufacturing capabilities. Western Poland was like the North, and Eastern Poland was like the South, basically. Additionally, Western Poland would be largely populated by those of Polish and German heritage, while Eastern Poland would be of Belarusian and Ukrainian heritage. And Eastern Poland, as it stood in 1918, consisted of at least parts of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine. Simply put, governing these different groups as part of a singular government in the still smoldering ashes of World War I was going to be an incredible challenge. Making matters worse, right after the end of World War I, the Soviet Union would decide that actually the territory on their western side that they agreed to relinquish and would eventually become Poland was still theirs, actually, and they wanted it back right now. This led to a relatively brief war that at least in part due to internal Russian problems with the Russian Revolution, resulted in a Polish victory. With this issue settled, Poland could hopefully begin actually rebuilding their new country. But a combination of the previously mentioned divisions, along with significant economic hardships and political turmoil, made this incredibly difficult. Poland would have to deal with the Great Depression like basically the rest of the world did, and they also had to deal with hyperinflation, much like Germany did in the early 20s, and they would eventually solve it in a similar fashion through the introduction of a new currency. Poland's population and workforce was also by and large rural and agrarian, up to around 70%, and their agrarian sector wasn't exactly advanced either. This meant that even in more stable financial times, a great deal of the Polish population would face issues with homelessness, poor wages, underemployment, and unemployment. These financial issues would be bad for any country. For a country that was so young, it's amazing that Poland didn't just melt into a puddle of kielbasa. There were also significant political problems, with the initial democratic government being not very good and also kinda corrupt, and there was also a military coup in 1926. So with these political and economic problems, including even more problems that I didn't go over like poor trade relations, you would think that their military would be next to non-existent. But in reality, their military was actually pretty decent, especially when you consider the economic and political turmoil, and at one point, Poland would actually be at the forefront of aviation, making some of the most advanced planes in the world. It's one of these advanced planes that I want to talk about next. A plane that was once at the forefront of the world in performance, and a plane that was effectively the one line of defense that Poland had against Germany. This is the PZL P11. Despite Poland's many problems, largely because of one innovator, they would manage to thrust themselves to the front of the world stage. In the late 20s and early 30s, the overwhelming majority of aircraft in any military arsenal would be biplanes, as the lower power engines of the time necessitated generating extra lift and sacrificing higher speed in the process. By the mid-30s, the biplane was on the way out, in favor of monowing aircraft that had access to much stronger engines, and by the time World War II started, the biplane was in the underwhelming minority of any major power's air force. It's pretty amazing how rapidly aviation technology evolved, and one of the men that helped push it forward was Zygmunt Pulaski, Polish pilot and engineer. Born in 1901, by 1927, at just the age of 26, Pulaski would become the lead designer of the Polish state-owned Central Aviation Workshop. And when that organization was reworked the next year into, and prepare for me to absolutely butcher some Polish language here, the Państwowe Zakłady Lotnicze, or PZL for short, he remained in his position and was tasked with creating a modern fighter for Poland's military. While wood and fabric biplanes were still quite common, although countries were more and more incorporating metal and high-wing parasol monoplane designs, where the wing would sit high above the plane, Pulaski would design something quite different. Poland wanted a modern metal fighter, and Pulaski would design the P-1, a high-wing monoplane, not too dissimilar from higher-wing parasol designs, but with a feature that would greatly improve the vision of the pilot without sacrificing the strength and stability of the wing. Pulaski would utilize the gull-wing. Instead of having a normal straight wing, the P-1's gull-wing design was quite the innovation. Similar to the wing of a seagull, hence the name gull-wing, the wing would extend from the body starting at an upward angle. Then, after a couple feet or so, the wing would pivot and go the rest of the way at a downward angle. On the section where the wing angled up, that area could be made much thinner than the rest of the wing. On later monoplane fighters seen in World War II, a thinner inner wing wouldn't really matter all that much. It wasn't really in the way or anything. But on a high wing plane, this was incredibly beneficial. The smaller inner wing would give the pilot much better vision to his front lower left and front lower right, and not having the parasol-style wing would give him much better vision to the front and above. Essentially, Pulaski and Poland already had in this design a plane with some of the best vision from the cockpit in the world. The rest of the design would be relatively basic, with a normal tail section, fixed landing gear, and an inline water-cooled Hispano-Suiza engine with around 600 horsepower. The P1 would largely perform best at low altitude, with a top speed of 188 miles an hour at sea level. The P1 would go on to participate in a fighter plane competition in Bucharest in 1930, performing very well and turning some heads. Past the P1 design, due to some kind of issues surrounding engine licensing, the inline engine of the P1 would be replaced with a radial engine, and PZL would get a license to produce the British-designed Bristol Jupiter engine, with around 450 horsepower. While these engines would be lower power and would have significantly more drag, they were also generally lighter and more rugged than the previous inline engines, which would help offset the detriment of lower power. Additionally, in the new and improved design, the P6 as it was known, the weight would be reduced by about 400 pounds, which would further help offset that detriment. With the top speed of the P6 sitting around 181 miles an hour, combine that with the excellent vision and all-metal body, the P6 was one of the most technologically advanced planes in the world. In 1931, the P6 would embark on a sort of world tour, winning the American National Air Races and receiving recognition at the Paris International Air Show for being one of the most modern and advanced planes in all of Europe. PZL would continue to improve upon the design, and while the P6 was going on its world tour, they were working on the P7, which was effectively a P6 with a stronger Jupiter engine that had over 500 horsepower. With this boost in power, the top speed of the P7 would be increased up to 197 miles an hour. But this time, that top speed would be achieved at altitude, not sea level. The P7's engine performed better at high altitudes, and considering that planes fight in the air and not on the ground or in the water, this was more optimal. To boost performance even further, a town end ring was added to the engine. On the previous P6 design, the engine cylinders were more exposed, which meant that there would be higher drag and actually less cooling efficiency, surprisingly. You would think that them being more exposed was actually best for cooling, but no, having what was effectively a circular cover around the radial engine both decreased drag and improved cooling, with some further refinements in the open cockpit giving the pilot a higher seat, and some refinements to the wings and control surfaces. The P7 was the first in this line to be selected for full-scale production. By late 1932, early 1933, the first P7 fighters would be delivered, and by late 1933, the Polish Air Force achieved a world first, in having the first frontline unit be fully equipped with all-metal monoplane fighters. For a new, mostly agrarian country, this was an incredible feat, and PZL would end up producing around 150 P7s total. However, there were actually a couple of early warning signs in the production of the P7. While the P7 was initially ordered in early 1931, initial production problems in the plane's body and some engine issues would delay production by at least a few months, if not over a year. Again, Poland was a mostly agrarian country, which meant that issues in mass production were almost certainly bound to happen. The first handful of fuselages that were produced had significant flaws that led to their rejection, and it would take several months for the assembly process to be reworked and refined. Then the company that was producing the British-designed Jupiter engines, Skoda Works, was struggling to produce enough of these engines. Going back though, when the P7 was still in its initial testing and prototype phases, Pulaski would attempt to improve upon it in the P8 and P9, both of which would use inline liquid-cooled engines. But these two projects amounted to rather little despite decent performance, and instead, Pulaski's sort of magnum opus fighter design would end up being the P11. It's not as if he had any real choice in this being his magnum opus, and he probably would have continued designing aircraft, but in March 1931 he would die in a plane crash, testing his P-12 flying boat design. Before his death, though, in response to the Polish Department of Aeronautics' request for a plane or planes to be powered by stronger British-designed Bristol Mercury engines, Pulaski and PZL would design the P11, a design that largely mimicked the previous P7. Initially in the P11's life, beginning construction in early 1931 while Pulaski was still alive, the first P11 prototype was basically just a P7, as the Mercury engine they were going to use weren't actually available yet. While they waited, the P11 would be used to test out some imported Gnome-Rhone Jupiter engines, to see how those engines compared to the Polish-made copies. But later in 1931, after Pulaski's death, the second P11 prototype would be finished, and equipped with the Mercury engine that had around 530 horsepower. With this slightly stronger engine, that was also a little bit lighter and actually smaller than the Jupiter, the second prototype would breach the 200-mile-an-hour mark, and achieve a top speed of 215 miles an hour in 1932. Poland would elect to bring the P11 into production first as an export aircraft, and the first production model produced would be the P11B, specifically for Romania. These aircraft would be outfitted with Romanian-built engines, and considering that Poland needed the money and they weren't in any immediate danger, this decision made sense. After the P11Bs were done and delivered by mid-1934, PZL began work on producing the P11A in very small numbers, only about 30 of them, and these ones were equipped with low-power versions of the Mercury engines that only had roughly 500 horsepower. After this, the main design of the P11, the P11C, would begin production, and it was largely with this plane that Poland would be defending themselves against the Germans. Measuring 7.55 meters long, 10.72 meters wide, and 2.85 meters tall, the P11 was quite the small plane by World War II standards, but compare it to something of its era like the P-26 pea shooter, the P11 was pretty normal in size. Still outfitted with the high-set gull wings and fixed landing gear, the P11 still appeared remarkably similar to the P7, and the difference between the P11C, the P11A, and P7 was very, very slight. In addition to having a more powerful 600 horsepower Mercury engine, the engine would be slightly lower on the frame to give the pilot better vision, the thin inner wing would be made ever so slightly thinner for the same purpose, the still open cockpit would be moved back slightly, and the pilot's seat would be raised again, once again for the same purpose, and the tail surfaces were slightly redesigned. All in all, though, one would be hard-pressed to see, visually speaking, all that much light between the P7 and the P11. For its armament, the bulk of the P11 fighters made would have just two 7.92mm machine guns in the fuselage, pretty standard armament for its era, and very outdated by World War II. Some P11s would have two additional machine guns in the wings, but the majority of them did not. There would also be room for two 27-pound bombs under wing, a very minor addition, but it was there and thus is worth mentioning. With the increased engine power, and on some stronger armament, the top speed of the P11C would be upwards of 242 miles an hour. Around 150 P11s would be produced for the Polish Air Force, and roughly 175 were made for exports to countries like Romania, Greece, and Turkey. So now the big question here is this. If Poland was making these planes in 1933-34, why exactly was this all they had by 1939? On September 1st, they only had around 130 P11s and 30 P7s, due to many of them being stored away, undergoing repairs, or converted to trainers. Why didn't they have more of them, or why didn't they have newer aircraft? Why did they seem to just stop? Well, for one, Poland seemed to be largely focused on the export market, as evidenced by the fact that they made more P11s for other countries than their own air force. A direct improvement for the P11, the P24, was exclusively an export plane, and over 200 of them would be made. I would assume that because of Poland's finances, it made more immediate sense to get the money from exports than to continue adding to their own air force. Additionally, Poland would try to improve upon the P11 in the PZL 38, a twin-engine monoplane fighter that basically would have been their version of the German Bf 110. However, due to significant issues in the small inline engines it was supposed to use, the project would suffer from significant delays and never got past the prototype stage. They would try to advance past that with the PZL 48, but that project only started in late 1938, early 1939, which was not enough time before the war started. Seemingly aware that conflict was very much on the horizon, PZL attempted to improve the P11 by outfitting it with a stronger engine. But by the time the war started in September, only one plane had been modified for this testing. Due to the failures of planes like the PZL 38 and 48, Poland would purchase French and British fighters, but the deliveries of these aircraft did not reach Poland before Germany invaded. So, armed with around 160 fighters on September 1st, 1939, going up against much more modern and better performing Bf 109s, Poland was in severe trouble. Now, Poland would be defeated rather quickly, that much is true, but the P11 actually managed to put up a surprisingly solid fight, despite being so outdated by 1939. In this invasion, Poland would be the first to lose an aircraft, with the P11 being shot down, but Poland shortly thereafter managed the first official Allied takedown, with a P11 destroying a Ju-87, despite being horrendously outnumbered, with the total German air forces numbering over 2,000 aircraft, and Poland with their 160 or so fighter aircraft and 640 or so light bombers and other small recon planes. The P11 would actually, in the end, destroy more than it lost. Poland would lose an estimated 114 of their 130 or so P11s, and in return, Germany lost a confirmed 126 aircraft to the P11. Not an outstanding kill-death ratio for the P11, but they were in the black, which is a win on its own. Germany would end up losing over 200 aircraft in the invasion, and considering that Poland's only effective aerial defense was the P-11 and some P-7s, it is likely that the P-11 roughly destroyed 2 German planes for every 1 lost. Poland would manage to accomplish this due to the P-11 offering greater maneuverability and pilot vision. While the Bf-109 and similar planes didn't have poor vision necessarily, the open cockpit and gull wings of the P-11 gave it excellent vision. Additionally, the P-11 was highly maneuverable, and considering that it was sort of a midpoint between World War II era monoplanes and biplanes of the previous era, this kinda made sense. So while the P-11 wouldn't be outrunning anybody, it could easily maneuver itself into a more advantageous position to destroy attacking fighters. Also, do keep in mind as well that a lot of the P-11s in the air didn't even have radios to communicate with one another. Despite falling in just over a month, Poland actually put up an incredible fight, and the performance of planes like the P-11 are actually indicative of the true strength and spirit of the Polish military. Overall, despite Poland being a new country with conflicting ethnic groups, significant economic problems, a mostly agrarian and peasant society, and a lot of political turmoil, they still managed to launch themselves to the forefront of aviation, and despite stalling out by the late 30s, they would still manage to put up a solid fight against the German invasion. And for this, we should commend Poland for what they were able to accomplish. I mean, they did go down in the first round, basically, but they did get a few shots in, and that's not nothing. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So something that I learned today and wanted to share, even though it has zero relation to what we were just talking about, is that Bob Dylan, the musician, once performed under the name Ted Ham Porterhouse. It kind of sounds like the name of a adult film star, we'll say. I mean, how different would his career have been if he went under that name instead of Bob Dylan? It's the legendary album Blonde on Blonde by Ted Ham Porterhouse. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.